The coffee you drank this morning, the smartphone in your pocket, the chocolate you gave your child, and the clothes you're wearing right now, statistically, at least one of these items was likely produced using slave labor. There are more people in slavery today than at any point in human history, trapped in conditions our great-grandparents thought we'd abolished forever. Today, I'm sitting with someone who experienced a devastating awakening 30 years ago when he interviewed 350 young girls trafficked from Nepal to India, then watched helplessly as nearly all of them died of HIV within 5 years. That experience could have broken Matt Friedman. Instead, it forged him into one of the world's most relentless advocates for those 50 million people living in the shadows. With over 35 years spanning US aid, the United Nations, and now as CEO of the Mekong Club, Matt has helped rescue more than 4,200 people from slavery and spoken to over 120,000 people across 30 countries. His latest book, Where Were You? A Profile of Modern Slavery, asks each of us the most uncomfortable question. While millions suffered in slavery, where were you? And now, what will you do? Matt, welcome. Your work forces us to confront not only humanity's darkest shadow, but our own unwitting participation in it. Matt, there's a moment in every advocate's journey when the abstract becomes viscerally real, when statistics transform into faces, and when human trafficking stops being a policy term and becomes a confrontation with evil that exists in plain sight. It's clear to me your awakening didn't happen in some remote corner of the world, but in discovering that sexual slavery operates like a business, methodical, organized, and hiding in the shadows of our everyday world. Take us back to that first moment when you realized the scope of sexual slavery and what shattered your previous understanding of how this industry operates.
I'm going to give you two stories because I think both of them are relevant. And the first story takes me back to when I was 5 years old. I was a rascal, and near our house was Cedar Mountain. And, I had this bad habit of going up there by myself to find lava rocks, and I'd bring them back and put them under a bush. And so my mom found out that I was doing this. So she took me outside and she pointed at the rocks and said, "Matt, are you going up on Cedar Mountain?" And I said, "No." "Are you sure you're not going up there?" And I said, "No." But then she told me a story, and this story was kind of helped me to understand that there are bad people in the world. The way the story went is my grandmother was coming from Germany to meet up with her husband, my grandfather, who was in Los Angeles. And he got there settled, and then he sent for her. So she took the boat, got to Ellis Island, got on a train, and when she got to Chicago, she thought she was in Los Angeles, but she didn't speak any English. So she was going around in German saying, "Am I here? Am I here?" Finally, this guy comes up to her and says, "Yeah, you're here. Your husband told me that you're supposed to come with me, and we're going to take you to where he is." Now, he was a white slaver. He was about to take her off to a brothel. She would have been forced into sex. I wouldn't be here having this conversation and so forth. But instead, what happened is another German couple saw what was happening, got her on the train, and then basically she made it to Los Angeles, and they became the godparents of my mom. Now, I tell this story because even at 5 years old, I had been told this because she wanted to articulate to me the fact that there are bad people out there in the world. Actually, a couple of years later, I was getting a master's degree in New York City, and I was doing some counseling. I had a degree in psychology at a multi-service center where you had a lot of troubled kids that would come in, and some of them were streetwalkers. And so I had an opportunity to have conversations with young girls who maybe 6 months before were in school and they had a regular life, and then they met a boy and they fell in love, and the family got into trouble, and he got her into drugs, and eventually she got kicked out, and then she was on the street. So I was seeing these young women who were on the street in a situation where they didn't want to be there, but they were forced to be there. So that was the second thing that happened to me. But the thing that kind of got me over the line, that kind of woke me up to all of this, was I was working for USAID in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was basically to translate resources into healthier people. At that time, we were finding girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Couldn't understand what was going on. So I started going to the shelters where the girls are. And I pretty much heard the same story over and over again. This human trafficker would go into a village, flash a bunch of money around because he wanted everyone to think he was rich. He'd then go and say, I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife, I want a village wife. Find a girl 12 years old, befriend her, go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, going to take care of our daughter, going to take care of us. Well, it's not uncommon to get married at that age. He goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to the capital, but don't worry, I'll be back in 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where he's going to sell her. When he gets there, he puts her in a room and he says, honey, stay here. I'll be right back. She was coming in. She saw all these people milling around. She said, don't leave me. I'm scared. She says, it's okay. I'll be right back. He then goes to the madam to get the $500 for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding and he hands the wedding pictures over. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in the year. The madam then goes into the room with the girl and says, guess what? Your husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day, every day, because I say so. You can imagine this girl's shock. Oh, my husband loves me. No, that's what happened. When many of these girls internalize this, they say, I will kill myself before I do those shameful things. The madam then brings out the photograph of the wedding. It's your mom, your dad, your brother. If you hurt yourself, will hurt them. So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You just bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a 2 day period of time, they use this girl 20, 30 times until she just lays back and accepts what happens to her. Then they put her on the line where she'll be there for about 2 years, 20 guys a day, every day, till after that, where she's so depleted physically and emotionally, they throw her out into the street. The girls I was talking to were the ones that made it back. Many of them didn't. So I was hearing this over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me, went into one of those brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. She saw this Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up, wrapped herself around me, and said, save me. They're doing terrible things to me. I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying. I turned to the police officer and said, we need to get this girl out of here. Said, we can't do that. So what are you talking about? You're a cop. He says, if we try to leave, we'll both be killed. To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more cops, but of course that girl was gone. Now I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-old high school kids that say when I grow up, I want to become an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But that girl's crying face was seared in my mind. After that, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. And I did what a lot of activists eventually do, surrender to the fact that now that I've been exposed to this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 35 years later, here I am talking to you.
That's quite a story. How do trafficking networks disguise themselves as legitimate businesses? And what does this reveal about our society's blind spots?
If it's prostitution, what they're trying to do is to lure a person away from their community. And so in the old days, what they would do is they'd go to malls and they would find a 14-year-old girl and say, wow, you're beautiful. Why don't you come and do some modeling with me? And then eventually get her to take a trip with them. And then they basically kidnap her and force her into prostitution. And they threaten the parents saying that if you tell anyone you'd run away, we're going to hurt your sister, your brother, your parents, and so forth. Another way is they hang out at bus stops or train stations. You have a 14-year-old girl having issues with her parents. They have a fight. She gets on a bus. She ends up in New York City. She doesn't have enough money to get home. Pimps are waiting for these people because it's a regular phenomena. What they do is they shower her with love and affection and so forth. Once she's in this situation where this emotional bond has been developed, then he starts pimping her out, basically saying, if you love me, you'll do this type of thing. And this happens not only in the United States, but it happens all over the world. But that's the sex trafficking side of it. The other side is forced labor. And an example of that, 15-year-old boy from Cambodia is told by his family, go down to Thailand, get a job. We're poor. You need to send money back. He's looking around for work, not finding it. Traffickers see this and go up to him and say, hey, brother, you're from Cambodia. I'm from Cambodia. Let me help you out. Let me lend you a little bit of money. Now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to put you on a boat. The boat will go out for a couple of months. You'll catch some fish. You're a guy. Guys love fishing, right? After that, we'll give you money. We'll send you home. Everything's going to be great. Goes down to the boat, gets on the boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months, stays out there for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 17, 18 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten, he gets tortured. The only food he'll have the entire time is rice and fish, nothing nutritious. To get him to work, they give strong stimulants. Oftentimes they get injured. They get injured. They don't bring the boat in. They just throw them off the side of the boat. After at the end of the 4 years, boat comes in, guy goes to the captain and says, "Give me something." Captain says, "Go away. You're legally in my country." Guy says, "I'm going to tell the police." Captain laughs and says, "Go ahead. We own the police." So this is an example of those types of things. In the United States, you see this in the tomato farms, in the orange farms where people are picking things and so forth, where if you get smuggled across the border, you have indebtedness, and that indebtedness holds you in place to those criminal networks. That's why in the United States, it's estimated there's 1 million people in modern slavery. That includes sex trafficking, forced labor, domestic servitude, all kinds of other things as well.
Psychologically, what happened to you the first time you witnessed organized sexual exploitation? How did you process that initial shock?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you've never seen like a car accident and you see what happens in a car accident, there's that visceral sense of, wow, this is something that I've never experienced before. So initially, my response in order to cope with this is anger. Anger at the Johns, anger at society, anger at the traffickers, and so forth. So I would use that to basically mask the fact that as I was interviewing these women and girls and hearing all the trauma that they went, it was my way of basically coping with that. But every once in a while, the window would open. Like I was doing a panel discussion, and the facilitator asked questions of three of us. And the first person who he asked, she asked the same question you did. How do you respond to this? And the guy started crying and bawling like a baby. He had experienced some things that were happening in Cambodia were terrible, 5-year-old kids being used by pedophiles and so forth. So I'm looking at this guy saying, I'm glad it's not me. But then she asked me the same question, and for some reason, the window opened and the same thing happened to me. I couldn't control myself. I started bawling because when you are dealing with all of these people who have pain and suffering, you internalize a certain amount of that pain and you can compartmentalize it to a certain extent. But every once in a while, it just hits you. In my career, 3 or 4 times, I've gone into deep depression where I was so overwhelmed with the death of people that I knew, or the fact that I felt like nothing was happening, or I felt like I was failing at what I was doing. But each time, after a couple of weeks, I'd start getting calls, I'd start reading articles, and I'd come back again. And the interesting thing is, I'd reach a point and then I'd drop down. But when I came back again, I was a little bit stronger than I was before. And because I had developed a certain amount of grit that goes along with this type of thing. And it's the same thing with police and ambulance drivers who see all kinds of terrible things. You just get used to it over a while. But the interesting thing for me is it's not the pain and suffering that bothers me. Out of the 50 million people that are in modern slavery, last year the world only helped 133,000, which is 0.2%, not even 1%. That's the thing that really depresses me. After 35 years of working at this, and at present with the cuts, the US government, there used to be about $400 million globally to fight this. Now it's down to about 220 million at a time when the numbers of human traffickers continues to grow.
There's a chapter in your book, Inside the Brothels. When I read that, I was thinking to myself that most of us will never cross the threshold of a brothel and never witness the mechanisms of sexual slavery firsthand. But you've walked into these spaces, not as a voyeur or investigator seeking sensational stories, but as someone trying to understand how human beings can be systematically reduced to commodities. So, what you discovered behind those doors challenges everything we think we know about consent and choice and survival. What did you see inside these places that the outside world does not understand about the reality of sexual slavery?
I'll just give an example of one that I saw in Mumbai. So you walk up a flight of stairs, and when you get to the first level, you get to what's called a parlor, where you'll see lewd pictures and you'll see some X-rated magazines and so forth. And it's colored in a very bright color, and you might have some women sitting around in saris. Those are the women who are there to basically take the customers upstairs. The floor above that, you would have rooms that have air conditioning. They're tiny rooms. They're almost like closets or a fan. But that particular location is for people who are willing to reach into their pocket and spend a little bit more money. Above that is the pillow house, where you basically have a line, a rope, and then these just sheets that are hanging down that separate mattresses. So these are for the people who only have a dollar in their pocket type of thing. Then when you get to the higher floors, sometimes they have the children, the kids, where they have to be hidden away because there's certain clients that have a predisposition for, having sex with children. The reason why they will do this is because, number one, some people feel like if you have sex with a child and you have a sexually transmitted disease, it'll take it away. Another myth is that if you have sex with a child, you can't get a sexually transmitted disease, which is just the opposite because the trauma associated would create infection potential for her. And the last one is if you have sex with a child, you can revitalize yourself. So something about the vigor of a child. So those children are hidden away because if a raid does take place, that's where the brothel ends up getting into trouble. And it's not as if these people will necessarily always go to jail. Sometimes they just have to pay a larger bribe to the local police in order to allow them to go back to the place where the brothel is. That's like a typical brothel. It's hot, it's sweaty. The plumbing and the mildew and the smell and so forth is there because the people who own the buildings don't have to fix it up and they don't really care about it. And I've never really experienced evil until I started to go into these places. You can just feel this visceral sense of something around you that's just wrong and just bad. And in the air in terms of a kind of feeling. And there were times when I almost felt like I was suffocating. I have to just get out of that place because I couldn't take it for very long.
I understand from your book, they had box under the beds where the children could go into when they were experiencing a raid.
Okay, so the ones that are being used for sex, that's different. But within brothels, a certain percentage of the women in prostitution were allowed to have kids. But you can't have a 2, 3, 4-year-old kid running around in a place like that. So they would often sedate them for long periods of time. So what you're talking about is they would have a little mattress under the bed so that to avoid the kid from running around and disturbing people. And the other part of it is that they had to be concerned about the kids being approached by the patrons there. If kids looked like they were available and these people were drunk and they had a disposition for children, then that would happen. In fact, one of the stories, I don't know if it's in that book or it may have been one of the other books, is there was a woman who was trafficked from Nepal to Mumbai. She got pregnant 2 or 3 times. On the fourth time, she had the kid, and the madam said it was okay, you can have it. Because you need something to motivate a person to want to live. And so this woman fell in love with her son and everything. But one day, one of the patrons basically tried molest him. And so she went to the madam and said, "Can I send my kid to school?" And so, for whatever reason, the madam agreed. And so the madam paid for the school. It wasn't that much, it was a local school. But like once or twice a year, this woman would be able to go to the school and she'd just stand on the side and look at kid didn't remember her or anything. But for years and years, that's all she did. She never introduced herself. But she got AIDS and she was dying. And her son, who was brought up within this boarding school, was graduating and she just had to make sure that she made it to that point. What she described was that like she got to this point where he graduated and she walked up next to him and she just touched his robe. That was enough for her to feel like she had this connection. A couple of months after that, she passed away. These are the real human stories. Even in these situations, these people have lives. They carve out a life within this horrible situation that they're in.
If there's a circle of hell that's reserved for the worst of humanity, then it's the trafficking of children. I know your work has brought you face to face with perhaps the most devastating aspects of modern slavery and the systematic exploitation of the most vulnerable amongst us. Children who should be learning and playing instead find themselves trapped in labor and sexual exploitation and situations that steal not only their freedom, but their childhood itself. How does child trafficking differ from adult trafficking in terms of the methodology and the control mechanisms?
I'll tell you a Bangladesh story. In order to better understand about human trafficking, the real experts are not me. They're the people who have been trafficked or the traffickers. And so we often had access to victims of human trafficking, but we didn't have the perpetrators. And so we managed to get into the prisons in Bangladesh so that we could interview these guys. And so there was this one guy, and his name was, I think, Ali. Initially, he was saying, I'm a victim, I shouldn't be here. But we knew that he was a big trafficker. And so the thing about these criminals is they're all narcissists. So I pointed to Muhammad over there and I said, wow, he's the best criminal I ever met. I never met anyone smarter than him. All of a sudden, Ali gets up and he's like, I'm smarter than him. And then he tells you everything that he does. One of the stories that he told was there was this factory that was taking 50-gallon kind of containers of this very toxic liquid, and they had to put it into smaller containers. So when they trafficked adults into these sweatshops, their mind would be burnt out within 3 months. But if you have a kid in there, the kid will last for 6 months before the mind is fried because they're younger and the mind is fresher. So he was talking about how there was this rickshaw person and he took the kids back and forth to school. He owed money. And so they said, well, we need 5 kids or we're going to kill you. So the guy brought 6 kids on a particular day, and they were going to end up being in this situation. And when the trafficker was talking about that, he was laughing, saying, ah, ha, ha, I only wanted 5 and I got 6. I wonder what that parent felt like, and so forth. When you hear the stories of the victims, we feel compassion for them and empathy, and we want to help them. But when I hear these guys talking about their experiences, human traffickers, it sends a shiver down my spine. You know, I'm a
Mm.
parent. I think about my kids when they were that age and what if that happened to them? I had another experience. I was in Vietnam and I was a UN official, and this guy calls me up and says, I want to meet with you and learn about what you do. As a UN person, that happens all the time. So this guy met me at a restaurant in Hanoi near the lake. You know, it was a nice restaurant. And for an hour, I talked about what I did. Then I turned to this guy and I said, what do you do? He said, I'm a trafficker. I said, excuse me? He says, yeah, I'm a trafficker. I never had a chance to talk to somebody else. I'm so grateful that you gave me this time. All those things you say, they're true. I do them all. And so I had two choices. I could either get really huffy and leave or sit down and continue talking to him. And I chose to talk to him. And for the next hour, he just kept going on and on about his business. He gave me his card and says, go ahead and try to catch me. You won't. But the other thing he kept saying is that you guys are so ridiculous. You have to follow rules and regulations, and you have to get reports, and you have to raise money, do all that stuff. We don't have to do any of those things. You guys get anywhere close to us, we mutate, we evolve, we hurt somebody, whatever. And he was right. It's an unfair fight. There's a 500,000 criminals out there. There's about 40,000 do-gooders like me that are in the world trying to address this thing. They have $236 billion generated from this illicit crime. We have now less than 220 million. I mean, how do we expect to be able to address this? But to go back to the point that you alluded to in some of the questions you have, we're talking about kids. We're talking about girls. We're talking about underage people being in this situation. There are 6.3 million women and girls and men and boys and to have sex against their will. That's rape. It's not consensual. So let's say that each of them is basically with 5 people a day. 5 times 6.3 million. How many rapes is that every day? How is it that we can allow the world to allow for this to happen? In the United States, it happens. In Europe and Asia, it's everywhere in the world. And yet we get so worked up about little things around. And I live in a world where I see all this happening and I can't understand why it is that we can't get people excited about it.
What does prolonged exposure to trafficked children do to someone's faith in humanity? How do you maintain hope?
Okay, as I say, there have been times when I have broken down and got really depressed and decided I wasn't going to do it. And for whatever reason, I had a good support system and people who I cared about that were around me. But on the other side, the fact that, I'm so frustrated that we're not making a difference. We as practitioners have to use the starfish parable. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
I'll say it for your audience, for those who don't know it. You have the father and son walking down the beach, and the father sees like a starfish that's beach, picks it up, throws it in, sees another one, picks it up, throws it in, does this for about a kilometer. The son looks at his dad and says, Dad, this beach is 9 kilometers long. How can you possibly help all these starfish? What difference does it make? Dad looks to the kid and says, well, to every starfish that gets into the water makes all the difference in the world. So we as practitioners have to accept the fact that everything that we do to help a person needs to be rewarded and to be cherished and to be accepted as a little bit of good, a baby step in the right direction. Because if we look at the big picture, it'll just overwhelm us. We won't be able to accept the fact that it feels like failure when all these people need us and we're not able to help them.
And in terms of the counter-trafficking community, finding modern slavery, I would suggest, has created an unlikely condition of the former law enforcement officers, social work, reformed traffickers, potentially survivors, business leaders, and activists who might never have crossed paths under
Yes,
normal circumstances. But
that's
you've
right.
discovered that this community has its own complex dynamic, competing agendas, and sometimes I would imagine conflicting approaches to what really should be a unified mission. What surprised you most about the people drawn to anti-trafficking work, and what motivates someone to enter this field?
There's a couple of different motivations. One of them is personal trauma themselves. My wife and I ran a mission here in Hong Kong, and there were a number of women who would approach us to say that they wanted to become volunteers, and they were somewhere between 18 and 24 years old. But many of them, we found out over time, had their own personal traumatic experiences. Maybe it was incest or rape or some type of abuse. And so, because they felt that pain inside of them and they couldn't solve it for themselves, they were drawn to human trafficking to try to sort it out for other people. Now, we immediately came to realize that this wasn't a good recipe for them. It would be triggering and so forth. And so we brought in counselors and try to help these people through this process. So that's one group. The other group is we as human beings don't pick our causes pick us. I didn't wake up one day and say, should I do poverty alleviation or bullying or human trafficking? Every time I looked to the left or the right, this was in front of me and it drew me in. My sister doesn't care about human beings. She cares about animals. And that's what her thing is. My brother, it's, climate change. There's a certain number of people within law enforcement, within the business world, within the academic world, within the faith-based world that for whatever reason are drawn to this particular topic. In fact, I see this every time I do a presentation. I'll get up in front of 100 people, I'll do an hour talk. There'll always be 4 or 5 people that come up afterwards and say, I don't know what it is about this topic, but I need to be involved in this. I need to help. And what we try to do is to mind these people, to engage them. And so I wrote another book called Be the Hero, Be the Change. And it was based on the relevance and the importance of volunteerism. Because you heard that less than 1% of the people are helped in human trafficking. But if you look at girls' education or bullying or drug abuse or any of these other things, we're at less than 5% for all of those things. And the reason is the number of people like us who do this relative to the size of the problem is insufficient. So we as the general public and as human beings have to accept some responsibility, figure out what our cause is, and then step up and get involved to be able to address that. When I say that to an audience, if I could get each of you in here to do one thing, that's 1 times 100. Or if it was 1,000 people, 1 times 1,000 or 10 million, and the numbers add up. So the simple things people can do is, learn about the problem, and then tell somebody. And awareness raising is important because whenever I get in front of an audience, I ask about a quarter of the way into my presentation, how many of you people knew 10% of what I was talking about before I said it today? I get one hand, maybe two hands, oftentimes no hands. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. You can be a responsible consumer before you buy, I don't know, I'm just using this as a prop, something. Go online to see if a company has a policy related to human trafficking. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, in a very polite way, say to them, listen, I like your products, but I'd feel better if you had a policy. Most major companies now do, but this encouragement helps them. You can volunteer. My youngest volunteer was 9 years old. This girl saw me in a documentary. She said, Mr. Friedman, human trafficking is awful. I want to help. I said, you're 9 years old? She said, so what? I said, you're 9 years old. She said, 9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a
Hmm.
chance. So I said, what is it that you can do? And she said, I can find anything on the internet. So I had a couple of Ivy League second-year law students, and I gave them an assignment to find something on the internet. They couldn't find it. Gave her 2 days later, I had everything I needed. Because each of us has a God-given gift. It could be internet searches, it could be public speaking, it could be planning, it could be networking, it could be selling teachers. It doesn't matter. If you apply that to volunteerism, it makes a big difference. Donating money to organizations that do the good work. In this day and age, there's just not as much of that funding available. And so find the cause that you are interested and then find an organization, skip a couple of meals, give them a donation. It makes a big difference if it adds up to a lot of people doing that.
In terms of ego and competition for funding, I'm trying to structure this question. It's just come to mind. I'm thinking about ego and competition for funding and whether different philosophies can undermine the very cause that everyone claims to serve.
What you're talking about is a major problem within the NGO world. Okay, so you have two factors that are happening simultaneously. One is organizations comparing themselves to other organizations. It's kind of like in high school where people are comparing themselves to other people, and it's just a phenomena that happens. The second is you can't help another organization because if you do, that organization might get a funding boost off of your potential funding. And so you would think that the do-gooders that are within all of these organizations would be united. And in some cases, it happens that way. You can get the right organizations, but a lot of them just find it really hard to play in the same sandbox. And that's one of the things that I struggle with. And so the old days, I'd get 20 organizations in a room and I'd say, let's collaborate, kumbaya, and all of that. But as they're comparing each other, and if they're holding back and naysaying and everything else, it didn't work. And my newer approach, and I do this now with the Mekong Club and other things that I do, is I start off with one or two like-minded organizations who are committed to basically collaborating. And then we just jump into an assignment where we do something together to develop a sense of unity and momentum and trust. And then we add another group and then gradually add another one. So you're calibrating the people to this process of collaborating. And the other thing is to always help them to understand the high road. This is not about Matt Friedman. It's not about our organizations. It's about the people we're serving. Those are the people
Yeah.
we're here for. And if you forget that and you start getting protective of your organization and yourself and your reputation and your ego, then you've lost the narrative. So rising up and saying, come on, these people need us. We have to be there. We need to do everything we can. And for this to happen, we need to collaborate. So when you get two organizations coming together, 1 + 1 = 11, not two, because of the synergistic effects that happens. But for that to happen, you have to understand the psychology of the people who are trying to do this work.
So, where do you see the most effects collaboration happening, and where do you see the most destructive infighting?
I see a lot of collaboration taking place in the private sector. Now, the organization that I run, the Mekong Club, works with the private sector in a positive, supportive, not naming and shaming way. We work with banks, with the manufacturers, the retailers, the hospitality sector, because all of those businesses have a potential nexus with modern slavery. So the banks, $236 billion generated, if any of that money gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering and they get fined. There was a bank in Australia that was fined 1.3 billion Australian dollars. That has a devastating impact on not only their bank account, but also on their reputation. When it comes to manufacturing, you could have sweatshops within a supply chain. And if that becomes the front page of a newspaper and social media, has a devastating impact on the businesses. And then when it comes to hotels, hotels have to be concerned about construction and the food that they buy that could be tainted or sex trafficking. In the United States, if a 14-year-old girl is rescued out of a motel, that motel could be sued. And oftentimes, because of the moral repugnance of what we're dealing with here, the cases are won. And so the insurance companies don't want to fund the motel business anymore. So we work with these companies to educate and inform them to address this issue. And as part of that, we bring the banks together. We bring the manufacturers together. We bring the retailers, the hospitality, and they debate and discuss and identify what needs to be done because that's not their core business. Their core business is making money through banking and all these other things. And so they don't mind collaborating because they're not raising money to address that particular issue. The other reason why I work with the private sector is there's always a sense of urgency. If they find any vulnerability in their supply chain, they're going to address it within 15 minutes because they don't want the possibility of being perceived as a scandal. So despite what a lot of people feel about the private sector being the problem, in many cases, they do more to address the issue of human trafficking than the NGOs. You'll never hear about it because of the sensitivity of it, but they're out there doing this work to protect themselves. But at the same time, by doing that, they're making the world a better place.
There's a profound difference between studying trafficking as a phenomenon and sitting across from someone who's lived it. When you began systematically interviewing survivors, ultimately speaking with over 2,000 trafficked persons, you discovered that their stories not only revealed the mechanics of slavery, but challenged many assumptions the anti-trafficking community had made about victims and resilience and recovery. What did survivors teach you that you couldn't learn from law enforcement or reports or academic studies?
There's many ways to answer that, but I'll answer it this way. They don't want a V on their forehead that says victim defines them for the rest of their life. And that's really what often happens. They just want to have a regular conversation and treat them like anyone else and to understand that they have hopes and dreams and aspirations and everything else. The other thing is like every human trafficking victim has a different story in terms of their recovery. Some are so traumatized that they'll never recover from this. And others, I'll tell you a story. I was in Bangkok and there was a raid that took place, and I was there as part of the raid. At the end of this raid, there was a young woman came up and, well, thank you very much for helping us. I'd like to go home. I want to go see my mom and I got to get on with my life. And I was struck by the fact that she really was based on everything you would have assumed in her life, pretty together. And she was very coherent and everything else. And I found out later that in some ways the trafficking situation was better than what her home life was, where she was actually being used by her father and brother and various other things. Despite what people say, it was almost a step up. But then she wanted to get on to the remainder of her life. The next day, I'm in New York City and I went into a pharmacy to get some and there was a line of two or three people, and one of the person went out to grab something and came back. The person who was behind that person said, "You got to go to the back of the line." And so they got into this big argument, and then all of a sudden it became this big thing. They were shouting at each other. The manager came. They ended up calling the police. First world problem this big, where it was like 2 minutes of waiting in line beyond what you would have. That's the difference between some of these people. They are so hardened from the experiences that they have that they get on with their life. Whereas
Mhm.
in the West, we are so sensitized to things have to be a particular way. If you vary from that, it creates an emotional response to it. Get over yourself. There was another situation where in Nepal, there was a group of women who wanted to set up a shelter. So they rented a place and they got the beds lined up and they put some stuffed animals on it and some posters, and they had a little sewing machine that they were going to teach them. And so they had these expectations that these girls would come back and run up and hug them and they would be saviors for them. But the young women who came back had been in the brothels for a long time. They drove up in a van, and when they got out, these are some tough girl. They had tattoos and they're chewing tobacco and they're swearing and everything else. They go into the room and they throw the stuffed animals off and they're fighting over the bed. They see the sewing machine and they say, "Ah, you think I'm going to do that? I can go out and make a day's wage in 15 minutes by just going out in the street." So the expectations that people have is that victims are a particular way. Some of them are exactly the way these women anticipated, but not all of them. And so you have to adjust yourself to the fact that there's no cookie cutter approach to addressing trauma. There's no cookie cutter approach to addressing victimization. You have to address the person where that person is and give them the time and give them the compassion to allow them to get to where they need to be, for which you help them through that process. At the same time, you have to treat them like anyone else, like a regular human being, and not treat them as the victim with the V on their head, because that doesn't define them. I was in a bad car accident. That doesn't define who I was. I had cancer. That doesn't define who I am. They were victimized. That doesn't define who they are. It's an experience that they want to get over, but they want to get on with their life as well.
How do you create space for someone to tell their story when reliving it might re-traumatize them?
First of all, you have to be trained to be doing this type of work. I happen to have a degree in psychology, but there are times when, obviously, as a man, I can't go and address the needs of women. And so, generally, what we try to do is to have a woman who's doing the interview, if I'm sitting in or I'm watching from the outside or whatever. It's extremely important. And this is where law enforcement gets it wrong. But first of all, there's almost a voyeuristic sense. Oh, you were in prostitution. Oh, and how many guys were you with and how much money you gave? That's just like the most inappropriate type of thing that you could possibly imagine. And so you have to basically understand how to have an interaction with somebody like this. When I realize that I'm the wrong person, I can just see it, then I'm going to leave immediately and have somebody come in and take over from where I am. And to a certain extent, as a Caucasian, middle class male from America, dealing with cases here in Asia, 97% of the time, the inappropriate person to be doing that. They need to have somebody from their culture. They need to have somebody who understands. But you have to understand in this part of the world, even if a person is tricked and deceived into prostitution, they still carry shame because of the concept of karma. So there was a girl in Bangladesh. She was picked up off the street, pulled into a van, brought to Calcutta. She was used for 2 weeks. We managed to rescue her, get her back into Bangladesh. And we thought that nobody heard about it. But somehow the village heard about it. So we went and we drove her there, and it was me, an NGO person, and her. And then you see her father and mother and the kids lined up, and you could see that she just wanted to run into her mom's arm. But as she started to do that, the father put his hand up and said, "You can't come home. You brought shame to the family." She said, "I didn't do anything." He said, "It doesn't matter. We'll never get your brothers and sisters married, and we'll be shunned in this society. You have to leave." So you could see the father had that love in his heart. He wanted to be there. He loved his daughter, but the traditions in this part of the world are unforgiving. So she had to leave. We brought her back to the shelter. A couple of weeks later, she just disappeared. I always felt like she died of a broken heart.
Were there any other themes in those 2000 stories that surprised you or contradicted prevailing wisdom about trafficking?
I guess the story that names the book. And so years ago, decided I want to write a book based on human trafficking to raise awareness. And so I was doing a lot of interviewing. And so I knew the NGOs and I supported them. And I went to one of the shelters and there was a girl named Geeta. And every time I approached her, she said, "No, I don't want to tell my story." But she sat and listened to all of the other stories that were there. When I was done and I was leaving, Gita comes running up and says, "I changed my mind. You can have my story." So Gita sat on one side of the story, the rest of us on the other side of the story. In over a 3 hour period, she just told the worst story you'd ever heard of rape and torture and disease and murder. Honestly, it was off the charts. I had heard a lot of stories, but this was the worst. I didn't know what to say to her. Finally, I turned to her and I said, "Gita, wow, you must be so angry at the traffickers for the horrible things they did to you." She paused and paused. And she said, "No, I'm angry at you and you." She pointed at us. She said, "Where were you?" Said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything right outside the brothel was right out in the open. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. She said they're just doing what bad people do, bad things. Said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS and she was dying. Now, I tell the story because Gita called us all out. We all expected she was going to be angry at the traffickers, but she's angry at us. And she has good reason to be. All those 50 million people in modern slavery have a reason to be angry because where are we? Why is it that this world isn't out there saying enough is enough? We have to stop this. This is terrible. This is horrible. I don't understand it. Whether it's in the United States or in Africa or Asia, with 6.3 million women and girls in these situations every day facing this situation. And I think that's the challenge of our time is to come find a way of helping to raise awareness to the extent that people just wake up and say, "Okay, enough is enough. This has to end."
You make the claim that we can end modern slavery in our generation. And given that slavery has existed throughout human history, that it generates an estimated $150 billion annually, and it currently affects 50 million people worldwide. I'm not saying that optimism might seem naive, but you argue that we have something previous generations didn't: technology, global connectivity, unprecedented wealth. So the question isn't really whether we can end slavery, but whether we will choose to. What makes you believe that ending slavery in our lifetime is actually possible when it's persisted for millennia?
Okay, so I have to qualify that statement because if we look at the trajectory that we're on, we're not even going to get down a million people. That's just the way it is. And if you look at the sustainability development goals that the governments have, by 2030, we're supposed to end modern slavery. And in fact, it's going up, not down. What I said in my book was if an asteroid was coming towards Earth, and if we had 2 years to stop it, And the only way we could get it to go to the left or the right is to end modern slavery. We would be able to do that in 2 years because there would be a motivation for people to do this. The reason why people don't relate to people in modern slavery is number one, something about prostitution makes people uncomfortable. These are bad girls. They must have done something to get into that. And on the forced labor side, these are migrants, lower socioeconomic situations, troublemakers, et cetera, as opposed to people that are just trying to live a better life for themselves and their family. If you can't relate to those populations, then you don't feel like it's your fight. And so that's part of the problem. The other thing that we did that was a mistake early on is we talked in great detail about the pain and suffering of these people. And it so traumatized the audience that they would say, I don't want to talk anything about this. Now, when I do a presentation, I'll do cases for the first 8.5 minutes in an hour, but I always end up with something hopeful. And my hope is through these podcasts and webinars and presentations to find those people who self-identify and come up and say, I don't know what it is, but I need to do this. And my first question is, what do you do? Oh, you're with a church or you're with a corporation, you're with a school or whatever. Okay, how can we give you what you need in order to take it to the next level? How can you be one of our ambassadors? How can you be one of the champions? And that's the way we're going to address this and any other issue we have in the world. We have to change the way we as human beings think to accept some responsibility for these issues and to accept that we have something to offer and then to step up and do something. So we need to move away from it just being the NGOs, the United Nations, and the governments to us accepting the fact that let's organize people who want to help so they can give back. And the reason why I say this is important, Peter, is that there's a lot of people who I meet that have pretty good lives. They have a good job, they have their family, but there's something missing. There's a little bit of an emptiness or lack of purpose. And they don't really know what it is. Some people say, I guess I'm just not making enough money. But what it is in their life take, but they don't give anything back. It's an imbalance. It's not their fault. That's the way society is. But when you get people to step up and this gets balanced, you see an awakening of a person. All I have to do is to get people over the line to get them volunteering. And if they're volunteering in something they care about, whoa, they're going to go off and do gooder junkies off of it because they all of a sudden realize they can salve their life the way it is, but at the same time, they can give something back, and that feels good.
Yeah, service is a very high principle. Zooming out, what would a comprehensive strategy to end modern slavery look like? Where would you focus resources first?
I would spend a lot more time working with the private sector. The only reason why I say that, like if you have a big company that has not only within the brand, but within the supply chain, 500,000 people, and then you put systems and procedures in place that protect that infrastructure, then you're protecting a large number of people. A lot of NGOs, community-based organizations, they'll address 100, 200, 500, maybe 1,000 people, but the private sector has an opportunity to do this in mass. So if you had 100 companies that had somewhere from 300,000 to 500,000, and you fix them all up and you put the systems in place, and they're already incentivized to be able to do this because they want to protect their business, then you have a large group of people. So it's one of the most cost-effective ways of addressing it because you don't have to raise money for them to do things. You act as the catalyst. They use their own resources. So you're amplifying the amount of money that's in my organization times 10 because they're using their own resources to get to where they need to be. Another thing is appropriate awareness raising. When I was doing work in Bangladesh and Mongolia, we would do soap operas. And so what we would have is 10 hours of drama. And you could get the best actors and actresses because we had donor funding. And then you could come up with scenarios and it shows what happens. The reason why that's important is because in Asia, most people who are exploited lie about their experience because if they go back and they say this, they'll lose face. And face is really an important part of the process. So nobody knows that there's all these people who have suffered because nobody's talking about it. But if you use the drama, then you can sensitize people to the fact that this is what's happening, this is how you protect themselves. Legislation is really important as well, helping to ensure that businesses address this, that law enforcement takes it seriously, that in the United States, in some states, if a 18-year-old girl is being used in prostitution, it's It's a misdemeanor. It's not even a federal crime, but by definition, by the fact that she's under 18, she's a trafficking victim. There should be very strict penalties for that. So there's a number of things that can be done. We just have to kind of put these things in place and do it across all the way across the board.
After billions of dollars spent and countless laws passed, and thousands of organizations who are dedicated to fighting trafficking, I see that the numbers tell a sobering story. And as you've alluded to, that slavery may actually be increasing. To me, it's a moment of brutal honesty that you also confront in your book, that despite decades of effort, are we actually losing ground? Are we losing the fight? And if so, what does that mean for how we can approach this?
When COVID hit, we went from 40 million to 50 million. And that's simply because of desperation. Let's say that you had a woman working in a factory and she was making pretty good money, supporting 10 people. The factory closed not for days or weeks or months, but for years. She used her savings, borrowed money, couldn't pay it back. And so they'll come and take a family member and put them off in a sweatshop or in a fishing boat or in a brothel, whatever. So that's one thing. Another form of human trafficking that happened as a result of COVID is young professional postgraduates are being tricked and deceived into scam centers in places like Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. So there's about 300,000 of them that are in these situations. And every day they have to get up from 6 till 11 and do scamming. If they don't meet their target, they're tasered, they're tortured, they're beaten. This is a form of violence that I've never seen in my 35 years. And a certain percentage of these people are tortured to death, and they videotape and then sell the videotapes to people who like that type of violence. So we didn't anticipate this was happening. It's a problem because you have two crimes taking place. You have the human trafficking into scam center crime, and then you also have the scam itself. About $65 billion has been scammed out of the United States from these scam farms. Whoever would have thought that this is the world that we're in now? Don't trust when you don't know anybody who approaches you and they want to be your friend online. That's going to be turn out okay because 90% of the time it's leaning in the direction of something bad that they're trying to put in place.
In terms of heroes and heroines, in your 3 decades of work, you've encountered people who risk potentially everything, their safety, their careers, sometimes their lives, I would imagine, to fight slavery. And these aren't the heroes we see in movies. These are, I would suggest, ordinary people who make extraordinary choices when confronted with evil. And their stories reveal something very profound about human nature's capacity for courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable darkness. Who are the heroes in this fight that the world doesn't know about?
A lot of the people who play those roles would be almost mortified to be perceived as a hero because they're just doing what they think is needed. They don't do it for any other reason other than to help people. But I'll give you two examples of heroes. There was a young woman who came back to Nepal. She had HIV/AIDS. She was about 15 years old. And she was so angry and she knew she was going to die. At that time, they didn't have the meds and so forth. And so she said, I'm going to go up to the hills and I'm just going to tell people about what happened to me. And so well, you can't do, you're not healthy and so forth. She said, what difference does it make? I'm going to do it. And we finally negotiated that there would be a social worker that would go with her. And so she would go to a village and sit under what's called a people tree and just start telling her story. And then there'd be 3 people and 5 people and 10 people. And then gradually over time, maybe 100 people, and she goes through the whole story. People are crying, and everyone's saying, "Oh my gosh, didn't know this was happening." And then somebody would ultimately raise their hand and say, "Okay, what can we do to stop this?" And then the social worker, "Well, I'm glad you asked. Down the road, we did this registration program, and in this other place, we did this sensitization program at the school, and let's now figure out what it is that you can do here." And so she did this until she got too sick, and then I don't know what happened to her, but I assume that she passed away. There are another couple of women who were on the border of Nepal and India, and they would stand at the crossing and they're looking to see if they see something that looks like it's trafficking. There's a young guy with 2 girls. There's certain prototypes. They would stop them and they would separate them and they'd ask questions. Their job was to basically prevent this from happening. So despite everything that happened to them, they didn't just become withering flowers and end up just hanging out and not doing anything. They took it upon themselves to be the champions, to see that this wasn't going to happen to anybody else. And that type of heroism, people say you've been doing this for years, you've done all this work and everything. I'm not a hero at all compared to these people. These are the real hardcore out there in the real world, taking it upon themselves to make a difference type people. I see these people all over the place. And they're not just in addressing human trafficking, they're in every walk of life. You see these people in your community for whatever reason, they're charged up and they're focused and they know what they need to do. When I look at these people, I see heroes all over the place.
And in terms of being from mistake, failure is an opportunity to learn. I don't see it as something shameful. I have the mindset that I'm going to shake the dust from my feet and press on. And you argue that the anti-trafficking field is littered with failed interventions and misguided raids and programs that may have inadvertently caused more harm than good. But you suggest these failures are not shameful secrets to hide, they're invaluable teachers. And your willingness to examine mistakes openly, including your own, offers a very rare insight into how even well intentioned efforts can go catastrophically wrong. What's the biggest mistake you've made in your anti-trafficking work, and what did it teach you?
My signature story is a failure. I didn't get the girl out. When I look back, there were 30 things. I was a big guy. I could have just grabbed her and run out. I recreate that in my mind all the time. That was a huge failure. But one of the things you're talking about is that the US government set aside some money so that like raids and rescues could take place in India. And so I was part of a group of people that would be asked, can we proceed with using this money for a particular raid that would take place? And, there was a particular location that had 10, 14-year-old girls in there. They did the raid, and then 3 months later, they came back and they said they needed to do another raid. And we looked into it. We realized it was the same place. So we said, wait a minute, didn't you shut that place down? And this the guy was protected, and the police were involved and everything, but the place is there, and he trafficked another 10, 14-year-old girls in there. And so 3 months later, they said same thing. And so we said, can't do another raid. You're contributing to human trafficking. I feel bad for those 14-year-old girls that are there, but if we take them out, another 10 girls are going to end up in that situation. You have to understand the complexity of the decisions that we make related to these types of things. In fact, in my public health days, we had something similar. I worked on a program in Nepal where there were 30,000 deaths of children because of acute respiratory infections and so forth. And so we did this program that reduced it by 30,000 to 20,000. And so we did this program. It was very successful and it was documented and everything else. And a donor came to us and said they wanted to take it over. And we said, no, we've worked with you in the past. You guys do it for a couple of years, then you give it back to the government. It falls apart. And they said, no, it's not going to happen. But sure enough, we gave it to them. 2 years later, they gave it to the government and it went up to 30,000 again. And like the decisions that we make in public health, the decisions that we make related to human rights, the decisions we make related to human trafficking have implications. And those implications deal with whether people live or die sometimes. And you see this in a military situation where the generals make decisions that can get people killed or can save them depending upon the decisions. And they make a lot of mistakes. And from that, they eventually get to a point where they get better and better at that. And in the counter-trafficking world, it's the same thing. I never shy away from talking about my failures, and I have so many of them. That's where the conversation almost has to start. What hasn't worked? Why hasn't it worked? So we don't have to waste our time doing that again. If nobody's talking about the failures, how do we know not to do something? And so much of the book talks about things that we did or should have done or could have done. And it's freeing to be able to not cover that up. I'm a champion of feeling like let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly in
Mm.
equal measure because all of that is extremely important.
Fighting slavery doesn't change your understanding of the world. I would suggest it changes you, because the psychological toll of carrying these stories, the strain on relationships, the moments of despair when the darkness seems overwhelming. And you open up in your book about the personal cost of dedicating your life to confronting humanity's worst impulses. And it's a raw examination of what sustained exposure to trauma does to the human psyche. How has this work changed you as a person? What have you lost? What have you gained?
I can't complain about spending 35 years focusing on this. I wasn't trafficked. I wasn't abused. I wasn't beaten. I'm living vicariously through the experiences of other people. They're the ones that need to be celebrated, and they're the heroes, not somebody like me. But what I've come to realize, I often describe that as a metaphor. There's a room, and there's all these curtains around the room, and most of us live in the middle of this room, and we can see what's happening. But if you look behind those curtains, there's some bad stuff that takes place. And a lot of us are completely sheltered from that whole process that is there. I happen to have peeked behind there and stepped into that world many times. And what I've come to realize is that the kumbaya sense that we have, the world is a good place, is not necessarily the case. I'm a firm believer that good will always triumph over evil, but we have to accept the fact that evil is there and that these bad things are there. And we have to accept some responsibility for protecting the people who find themselves in that situation. And I feel as a culture, we haven't done that. As a world, we haven't done that. That's the thing that is most frustrating to me. And I have to balance my contributions with an understanding that this is as much as I can do. And this is why I do presentations and podcasts. I'm very active on LinkedIn and all of that, because I just want to find those people who are like me that will join in and be a part of the solution to really help address these type of people. But again, it's been an honor and a privilege to have had the opportunity to live my life in a way that I can help people in whatever way I can. And when I look back on my life years later, I can feel good about my experience. Whereas in some studies, 65% of the people in the world don't like their jobs. And so they end up going to work and just wishing that it was the weekend. I wake up on a Monday and I say, wow, it's time to get back to work. And that's a really good feeling. So in some ways, actually, I don't feel like I've been working for the last 35 years. I do what I'm doing for free. I'm surprised that people actually pay me for this, because much of my early years was based on volunteering to do this. And then I segued from public health into addressing this full time.
But you're fulfilling your soul's contract.
Yeah.
That's the way I would characterize it. You've also positioned your work within a fascinating historical framework because the idea that we're living through what I believe you call a second abolitionist movement. And
Yes.
just as previous generations fought to end chattel slavery, you
Yes.
argue that today's activists and survivors and advocates are part of a new wave of abolitionists facing modern slavery. But
That's
this
right.
fight looks different. It
Yeah.
requires different tools and challenges than what Frederick Douglass or Harriet Tubman faced.
That's
They
right.
faced immense challenges due to the pervasive racism and brutality of slavery in the United States. They were both born into slavery and they experienced the horrors of forced labor and physical abuse and the constant threat of being sold. Beyond the inherent hardships of their enslaved status, they also faced active resistance and threats from those who sought to maintain the system of slavery. Yet at
Yeah.
its core, you suggest it demands that same moral clarity, that same refusal to accept that some human beings can be treated as property. So my question is, how does today's abolitionist movement compare to historical ones, and what can we learn from past successes and failures?
In some ways, we have so many more tools than you could possibly imagine. We have the internet, we have social media, you have AI, you have laws and procedures and processes and people who want to get involved on the one hand, but on the other hand, you have all of those things that results in apathy and a lack of purpose. And as you're on your phone and you just see all the issues and problems in real time, you can never get to a point where you draw a line and say that you're going to do something. Back then, there was no TV, there was no radio, there was no distractions. People would talk, they would debate and discuss, and they would see the problems that were in front of them and would address that. Now you see all the problems, but as a result of that, nobody can really get to a point where they just say, okay, let's take this and move forward with it. So all the potential for the tools there, the resources, and they're there. But in reality, if you have apathy, if you have a lack of focus, you have a lack of kind of a commitment in order to move something forward because you see all these other problems, why should I pick this over all of these other ones? Then you have a recipe for, it not working. So what the prescription is and the solution to this is to within this group of people who self-identify within their DNA that this is how they want to address this, is we need to develop an army to address this type of thing. Another thing is we lack a systematic plan. And one of these things that I wanted to do, and I haven't done it yet, but I think I'll probably do it sometime, is to go to a military and say, if this was your problem, what would you do in order to address it? Because not because of the weapons or anything, but the strategic planning, or to a disaster FEMA or something. What would you do if this was your problem, if you had resources? And you'd see a very practical set of things. Human trafficking has all these groups out there doing their own thing and so forth, but it's not a united front. And so, like when I was a donor, when I would go to Cambodia, and what happens is a raid takes place, they put in a shelter, they receive treatment and counseling and everything, and then they eventually give them vocational training, and then they get them home, and then they place them. So all of those are separate organizations. We would fund all of them collectively as a package in order to address that. If you did it individually, then they would, or maybe they worked with each other, maybe they didn't. Oftentimes they didn't. So if we package the response to human trafficking on the prevention side, the prosecution side, the protection side, then all of a sudden you have a situation where things start to work. And we've seen successes with those types of things. It's just that in the world that we're in, a lot of the funding that I had was lost because I don't have U.S. funding coming in as a result of what just happened in the last 4 months. And a lot of other organizations face the same thing. And if 40% of our time is fundraising and that's taking up a certain amount of our brain energy, we're not there to come up with the innovative ideas and approaches to be able to address this.
It certainly needs unification, and the prevention is part of the cure.
Yeah.
We come to the end of this conversation, but I'm sitting here processing not just the information you've shared, but the profound psychological challenge that you've presented to all of us. And what strikes me most deeply is how you've transformed personal trauma into collective awakening. That devastating moment with the 350 Nepalese girls, watching them die while the world looked away, could have led to cynicism or despair. But instead, you've alchemized that grief into 3 decades of relentless advocacy. That's not only remarkable, it's a masterclass in post-traumatic growth. You've shown us that modern slavery isn't some distant historical relic or abstract policy issue. It's happening now in our supply chains, in our communities, and it's connected to our daily choices. And perhaps most uncomfortably, you've revealed how our collective willful blindness enables it to continue. We don't lack the resources or technology to end this trade. We lack the moral courage to confront our own complicity. But what gives me great hope is your work with the Mekong Club, the recognition that sustainable change requires more than good intentions. It requires systemic disruption, business leadership, and the kind of strategic thinking that treats slavery as the solvable problem it actually is. And your book title really haunts me. Where
Yeah.
were you? This
Yeah.
is not an accusation. This is
Yeah.
an invitation to transformation, because
That's
the
right.
real question isn't where we were, but where will we be tomorrow,
We,
that and the day after that?
yeah.
So I'm deeply grateful you've refused to let us look away, that you've carried these stories when it would have been much easier to walk away, and that you've proven, even in the face of humanity's darkest impulses, that compassion and strategic action can still light the way forward. So, Matt, where can people find you, and do you have any parting words?
You can share my email address. I encourage people to follow me on LinkedIn. My wife also addresses the issue of human trafficking and empowerment of women and so forth. Recognize the power of that social media to raise awareness and identify people and so forth. Her name is Sylvia U. Friedman. I have 15 books out there. I have some books that I just give away. Like if anyone sends me an email, I recently did a novel in India based on 10 years. I'll send that to people because I want people to understand this issue. And I guess that the last thing I'll say is I have analyzed my life to be whatever number of years I have, let's say it's 85 years or whatever, that we have this great journey to reach our full potential. Everyone has a potential. When you're born and then there's the full potential, a lot of people don't come anywhere close to reaching it because they don't challenge themselves. They don't put themselves out there. They don't take risks. They don't fail. They don't overcome. And as a result of that, they're missing out on the full life experience in a kind of a weird way. Being exposed to all this evil and all this stuff related to human trafficking has challenged me in a way that it's forced me to grow. It's forced me to evolve. It's forced me to improve. It's forced me to rethink and to recalibrate. And ultimately, I've become a better person as a result of it. And I don't think I'm even anywhere close to where I want to be. I still have a ways to go, but I recognize that there is that ways to go. And I think if people were more self reflective on themselves and recognizing if they have that lack of purpose or that emptiness, and if they're not addressing it, then they may wake up one day and look back on their life and realize that they lived their life all wrong because they didn't take the cues that their spirit was telling them that they should be focusing on.
So can we move from comfort to capacity, and from pathology to process, and from blame and avoidance to truth and responsibility?
Yes.
For listeners, Matt's book, Where Were You? A Profile of Modern Slavery, is available on Amazon.
Penguin Random House has it as well. They published it. Yeah.
But more than reading it, and I've read through it, I challenge you to answer its central question and let that answer change how you live.
Yeah.
Matt, this conversation has been transformative. It's been an honor and a pleasure to speak with you. And this has been another episode of Consciousness Compass. Until next time, may we all find the courage to look directly at what needs our attention and the wisdom to take conscious action on what we see. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.